This is a Restless interview.
Welcome back to Restless, a postmortem on the young, restless, and reformed. And sometimes we even servant lead our wives, don't we, Pastor Michael?
Yes, we do. In fact, we're going to talk about servant leadership today. We're jumping back in to the middle of our interview with Aaron Renn of the Masculinist. So this is where I'm supposed to say, let's do that. And it starts.
So Aaron, you write the Masculinist, and you already mentioned that sex and gender is an area with the new Calvinists that you critique. Tell us about the Masculinist. Tell us about this kind of critique you're talking about.
Right. Well, the Masculinist started in 2016 as a monthly email newsletter. It was sort of an underground sensation, if you will. It had a lot of readers, but it was something I was doing on the side while I was doing other things. I really didn't promote it. It didn't even have a website. But as of about 6 months ago, I've sort of taken the thing more public. So I now have a website at themasculinist.com. We do blogging, we do podcasts, we do live YouTube interviews. I'm doing more media, and really, what I saw was that the church was not really doing a great job of reaching men, but which I think is pretty it's kind of this perennial hand-wringing thing, for a very long time. But what was new and unique, I think, about that moment was that these sort of secular men's gurus started to emerge that were attracting hordes of young men. Jordan Peterson became the most famous. When I started, Jordan Peterson, wasn't really, a huge factor. But even then I would notice, he had a YouTube page where he would give 2-hour plus lectures on Genesis, the book of Genesis. Here's my series on Genesis, several lectures, 2 hours long each with a couple 100,000 views on them. I'm like, there are 200,000 people are spending 2 hours watching this guy talk about the book of Genesis. And so there was this big, I realized these people were actually getting at something. And one of the things they were getting at was just a truer model of, what I would call intersexual dynamics. And the contrast that I always like to use is what, the new Calvinists will tell you women want. And what, I wasn't per se targeting the new Calvinists, but they're certainly in this general bucket. And what, the Jordan Petersons and these secular men's gurus would tell you. So, Matt Chandler, for example, would say, and he wrote this in Desiring God, I keep saying it, godliness is sexy to godly people. So the idea is, women are attracted to men who are on fire for God, and who are servant leaders, right? They affirm, they support, they serve their wife and their children. They're conscientious, they're kind, they're all these things. Jordan Peterson, the whole idea that kindness is the greatest aphrodisiac in marriage that Don Carson said, that's a classic statement. And Jordan Peterson says, girls are attracted to boys who win status competitions with other boys. And like, oh, well, actually that explains a lot more about the world very, very clearly. It's like, oh, that explains why, when you were in high school, the women and the cheerleaders wanted to be with the captain of the football team, right? For example. And so I think that what we see is, these secular guys, many of whom were frankly, attempting to use this knowledge for kind of evil ends. I wouldn't put Peterson in that, but many of the say there's this pickup artist community would be one of the many communities out there. They're like, well, here, let me tell you how this works. But all of them are kind of using this, and this stuff is very simple stuff that's validated in kind of the social sciences and psychology. You could go read Scott Yenner's book, The Recovery of Family Life, which is an academic book by a tenured professor that goes through many of these things. And, oh yeah, by the way, women are attracted to power and status, confidence and charisma, appearance and style, money. Those things drive attraction. And things like godliness have nothing to do with attraction. It really doesn't. I mean, godliness is not sexy. You go to the church. Why is it that the women are more interested in the worship leader than in the parking lot attendant? Those sorts of things. It really has little to do with their godliness. They sort of conflate two things. What drives attraction on the one hand, with what makes someone a good quality marriage prospect on the other. So there's kind of two separate things that you have. I think as a guy, you could all realize there are women that you might find attractive that you think, that's not somebody I'd want to marry. There's also people you say, oh, she's like a great girl, but I'm not attracted to her. And the ideal is you want to have both. You want to have someone you're attracted to and who is, who is also like great marriage quality. Of course, so godliness is very important, right? I'm not disparaging godliness, but godliness by itself does not drive attraction. And so you see these guys making a lot of statements like that are just kind of not true. Also, the complementarian gender system, largely, I'm not a big fan of it in a lot of ways. They basically sort of nominally affirm things like male headship in the home, but they, in essence, redefine it to mean the opposite of what a normal person would think that means. And again, the idea is if you're the husband and father, your role is to be a servant leader, right? You're to be the servant of all. And so it sort of redefines away leadership. So they've sort of undermined that. That's another one. And it's very clear. They don't, you'll notice they rarely ever make any statement that could be interpreted as talking about women's sin or women being accountable for some wrong. They beat men up, to the end. And my the one I always like to cite, there's a huge movement called Promise Keepers from a while back, aimed at men, but nobody ever asked women to keep their promises, right? There's nobody, women initiate 70% of all divorces, by the way. It's well known, well established that women are overwhelmingly the people who initiate divorces. You'll never even hear that statistic from these guys. So you'll search in vain for even that knowledge. And so there's a long range of things you can go through, right? John Piper, when he talks about women in combat, being allowed in combat, has to tie himself into a pretzel to somehow blame men for being too cowardly to fight. And that's why they're shoving women out to the front lines, which is, I think quite inaccurate picture of the realities of the dynamics around why women are in combat. So there's just a whole slew of things that they are, that they're wrong on that. I think they're very bad on the gender point.
So everyone in our audience, especially the men, have been told to be servant leaders. Can you maybe just kind of zoom in on what you mean by that, kind of even flipping the idea that complementarians say they're defending, which is male headship in the church and the home?
Well, I mean, if you just look at, for example, the example they like to use is, well, Jesus washing the disciples' feet. So Jesus said, I didn't come to be served, but to serve, to give my life, up, give my life over them. And they'll say, look at him. He's he's the leader. He's the God man, as they like to say, and he's washing the feet of his disciples. What they don't say is none of his disciples or followers got to define how he was going to serve them. In fact, in that example, which, it's in Keller's marriage book, it's in a lot of them. It's like Peter doesn't want Jesus to wash his feet. And he essentially has to order Peter, if I don't wash your feet, you have no part with me. So one, this idea of, okay, be a servant leader. Who defines the service that's to be provided? And then who determines whether you're doing a good job at that? These are some of the things that are kind of silent, and they use these sorts of, one. So one of I know Keller's material by far the best. So I got to kind of go back to him. There's nothing unique about his. It's like, are you going to use your headship to please yourself? Or are you going to use it to serve your wife and kids? So it's a kind of a dichotomy when the reality is those are not the only two options. That's like saying, are you with us or are you with the terrorist, when it comes to invading Iraq or something like that. The reality is that there are other options. For example, you could be leading your household in the service of mission for the kingdom, which is what, when Tim Keller made the decision to leave Westminster Seminary and go plant the church, Redeemer Presbyterian Church in New York, he didn't do it to please himself or his wife and kids. He did it on mission. And I think we see, and actually, I think his life is a great example. I always use him as he is a great example of Christian manhood, and that he went into New York City when it was a war zone, when the PCA's previous church planting attempt had failed, when 3-4 other people had turned it down, when his wife thought he was crazy. Do you want to do this thing? They got 3 kids. And he's like, we're going in. And, we're going in because this is an important mission. And then he and his wife are actually on mission together in doing that. And so I think, but this idea that there's kind of this choice. Again, that's just one of the ways that they sort of use this false dichotomy. Do you want to serve yourself or do you want to serve your wife and kids? Well, there's many other things that we could be doing. And so I think that if you look at the relationship between, say, Christ and the church, it's not what, they think of as a servant, what's described as a servant leader, I think, in these complementarian theologies. In fact, I was very struck by the concept of moralistic therapeutic deism that Christian Smith, and I can't remember his co-author, that they came out where they studied kind of evangelical youth and found that they sort of believed in this thing called moralistic therapeutic deism. As God loves you, he wants you to be happy, he wants you to be a good person, but he's not especially involved in the world or in your life unless you kind of need an exception, you need some help. And I think they characterize God in moralistic therapeutic deism as a sort of cosmic butler and divine therapist. And that is essentially the role of the husband in complementarianism today.
Interesting.
He's sort of like a butler and a therapist. He's supposed to be like an emotional support for his wife and kids, and he's supposed to be kind of like helping out and doing what they want. But, he doesn't have any agenda at all. You look at Mark Driscoll, he's like, well, guys, you might have to be giving up all your hobbies. You might have to be giving up all your friends. Men are like trucks. They drive straighter under a load. Or there's a famous clip from Matt Chandler. Why are you guys going to bed with so much energy? Why aren't you completely wrung out from, so he goes, you could just Google that phrase and you'll be able to easily find this video from Matt Chandler talk about this. Their vision of marriage is so unappealing. Like, why would any guy want to sign up for it? It essentially means becoming a doormat, a nothing. And so I'm, I don't think it's an accurate or appealing vision of manhood in a lot of ways. And again, and much of it, has little to do with, a theological complementarianism per se, but merely the way that is taught and sort of instantiated in the world. And so you sort of see that, another famous, there's a lot of ways you could just start asking questions about this. So like one of them is, a woman can do anything an unordained man can do. You'll hear that quip a lot. And it's like, well, does the Bible actually say that a woman cannot be the president of a denomination? My wife, when she was in a PCA church one time, she was on the pastoral search committee. They wanted to make her the chairman of the pastoral search committee. And their explicit rationale was, since the Bible doesn't say a woman can't chair the pastoral search committee, then that's a role a woman can do. And we should explicitly seek to place a woman into that role.
Sure.
So it was sort of, it was explicitly stated as that was the rationale. And so, again, I just take it back and is really the hermeneutic of Scripture that anything the Bible does not explicitly in black and white, no wiggle room, say we can't do is permitted. Is that a hermeneutic? The same people who say that then go to the Old Testament and use the example of Daniel praying over the sins of his people to create some massively expansive theology of corporate responsibility for, historic racial injustice. And like, they just had, it's it's sort of the, opportunistic hermeneutics on how they talk about these things. And it's like, it's very obvious. One of the things that's very obvious in this new Calvinism movement is there are the people who are involved in it, who are followers of them, like they're sort of like fanboys. They're sort of fanboys, these people. And there's almost no actual substantive analysis of what these people are saying by kind of the flock, if you want to call it that, or anybody else for that. And the people who criticize them, right? The people who might criticize them are predominantly going to be like egalitarians or people from other sorts of tribes. And so I think that there's too much of a fanboy mentality. And I would have described myself as a Tim Keller fanboy at one point. I really just thought he was like, he walked on water. There was nothing he could do wrong. I'm like, well, that's not actually true. He's a human being like the rest of us. And, there's a whole lot of things that I would just tell you he's excellent at, he got right. But that doesn't mean I have to agree with every single thing he does. Right. And you'll often see with these people that, like, if you criticize, somebody will criticize one of these new Calvinist superstars, and like an army of fanboys comes out and starts getting on your case. How dare you? That's slanderous. That's this, that's that. It's like, what's going on, people? Yeah. And the truth of the matter is, if you actually take, for example, a marriage book, a marriage sermon series, and really do a substantive and critical analysis of what it is saying, you will see that actually it's not that great. I mean, you can take it apart without any real theological training, just by looking at things like, well, how do they what are the examples of characterizations of men and characterizations of women in this book? And how do they talk about the various genders? And what you discover is, there are actually zero negative characterizations of women in these books, and like several and numerous negative characterizations of men. You could just do analysis like that. What sorts of illustrations do they tell from their own marriage? Do they ever tell a story where their wife was unambiguously at fault and doing something wrong? And no, you never hear, you rarely ever hear that. So it's like, you can just go through these. And I think this probably, they are more substantive, but I think that their actual argumentation is much weaker than is commonly believed. Most of the time, these people in the new Calvinist movement are seen as such geniuses, is because their acolytes are fanboys, and no one has ever really applied a truly critical lens to what they're saying. So that's one of the things I would say about them.
It seems almost too good to be true that they paint such an unappealing picture of marriage, as you said, and then they praise to the nth degree singleness.
Yeah. Yeah. That's it's a great example. That's what it's like, again, they're trying to, this is the cultural engagement model. They've got a lot of singles in their pews, particularly in these urban churches. And what do you tell them? Well, telling them they should get married, we're never going to do that. Right. So, it's like they create these affirmations of singleness. Yeah. But if you just look at these marriage books sometimes, I use the example of Russell Moore's book, The Storm-Tossed Family, I think it is. It's like, you just look at the cover and it's like a house being tossed around on the waves, and like, oh yeah, I want to sign up for this. Right. And I do think there's a sense in which, pastors do disproportionately see the downsides of family, because they're always being called on when there's been an affair or when there's problems in the marriage. So they get in a very unrepresentative sample of family life. I think, you don't have to argue that they're being nefarious here. I think that they just see up close and personal the traumas in families a lot. But I always say, no matter how much they extol the virtues of singleness, they're not trading their family for all the gold in Fort Knox. And so, yeah, it's, you're right about that. And honestly, they've their inability to talk, to kind of kind of level with people on the realities of long-term singleness, is kind of, I think, hurt a lot of people.
Yeah, I see this a lot. The example I always think of is, I think I first heard it from Tim Keller, but I've heard it a lot of other places too, is, Paul says, wives, submit in everything to your husbands. And then I hear from this group, submit if it's a really big decision and the man has the 51% of the vote in those really big decisions in the household. And that's about it. Right. And that does not seem quite right when you're, reading the two next to each other. Read that marriage book next to Ephesians 5, and it's like, wow, this is not quite lining up how I think it should.
Yeah, I mean, to be quite honest, I like some of the egalitarian people better in a lot of ways because they're very direct, open, honest, transparent about what they think. You don't have to read their stuff like you're parsing a Bill Clinton speech to try to find out what is this really saying when you start taking it apart piece by piece by piece. And again, I think these new Calvinist people are master communicators, master rhetoricians. The words that they use, the way that they describe things, the language, it's extremely intentional. It's extremely intentional. And some of them, they, even use what you might call a bespoke vocabulary. The way that they talk about things, they do not use kind of traditional evangelical or other Christian categories or words to talk about things because, they want to kind of have their own kind of view. They want to kind of have their own view of it. And again, rhetoric is not bad. And rhetoric is a tool. We should all seek to be good at rhetoric. But I think in some of these cases, it's really over rhetoricized.
How much of this is just coming out of the felt need to, reach people in a city or something like that, right? Where you have, I want to, like you were saying, earlier about, Tim Keller goes to this city. There are certain ways you have to talk. There are certain ways that you want to, communicate these things. How much of is it just, this milieu that you're in, you're trying to find the language that won't be so upsetting, that won't be so jarring to those that you're talking to. And so you want to use words like, servant leadership instead of headship, which can sound jarring, especially in a more feminized culture.
That, and they're trying to maintain a relational structure, as we've already described, across denominational lines, political lines, right? And so it feels that like there is a sense where they have to be very careful in their speech.
Well, you do have to be here's the thing. We can sit here on this podcast and say whatever we want because one thing is our audience is, not as big as their audience. When you have millions of people, right? The bigger your audience, the more care that you have to take in what you say, right? You just have to level up, right? In terms of what you're doing. And I do think some of it, like, I think when Keller came to New York, in their description of how they did that, that's like a master class in figuring out how to come into this new environment and very effectively evangelize that environment. Like in the 90s, my understanding is hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people were sort of being converted to Christianity there. Their services, could be half people who weren't Christian. They were coming in to see it. It was a very effective strategy, I think, for that era. And again, with the thing with the new Calvinism, though, as times change, your contextualization, if you want to call it that, needs to be recontextualized. And it's very hard to recontextualize. And that's why, I think if you listen to the stats, it's like almost all converts are being made by young church plants. And, that's one of the justifications you hear for church plant. Well, why is that? You create a new church plant and it's contextualized to the realities of the moment when it's planted. Then, 20 years later, the world has changed, but that church is still contextualized to its old model. Very difficult to reinvent yourself. Just like cities. I mean, a lot of cities, they go through a boom phase, then they go into decline. They struggle to reinvent. A lot of these Rust Belt cities have never reinvented themselves. Churches are like that too. It's not just the failure rate of new church plants, which is extremely high, comparable to startups. It's that even the successful church plants enter the decay phase, after a generation in many cases, and you have to essentially figure out how to recreate, and refound that church again and recontextualize to a new scenario. And I think it's much rarer to see churches, how many sort of conservative, well-known conservative churches are there in the United States that are even that are 100 years old or even 75 years old? Very few churches that are like you can name some. You could say like Moody Bible Church has kind of been there, or 10th Presbyterian would be another one. But it's one of these things where like everybody wants to look at the mainline churches and say, see, they're dying and this and that. Well, they're also older. And, when Redeemer Presbyterian Church is 125 years old and, and not 30 years old, will it still be going strong as well? So I do think there's this element of, the contextualization works. It works for a season, right? Something works for a season and then it stops working. And it's like what I'm doing, it's only going to have, there's only a limited shelf life in what I'm doing. And the Aaron Renn style it's going to succeed at some level. It has succeeded at some level. And the question is, I'm not going to be able to keep doing what I'm doing forever. If I don't reinvent it or something doesn't happen, then, it's going to go into a decline as well, because the world is just changing. You can't keep playing the oldies forever. And so, yes, I think that these guys came in and, certainly, in a lot of ways, evangelistic motives in developing it. Again, I do think New Calvinism, as itself as a movement, had a power politics component to it from the beginning. I think that's a good way to look at it. But again, that doesn't mean it's nefarious, but it does mean that, again, it was a product of a specific era. And as the eras change, it becomes less effective, and it would have to be somewhat reinvented. And that's very difficult to do, certainly as long as kind of the same leadership. It usually takes changes in generational turnover and leadership and other things like that. It's sort of like, maybe it's like a basketball team or a football team is really successful, and then that legendary coach retires. It usually takes 2 or 3 coaches you got to go through before you find somebody that can rebuild the program successfully again. I think there's probably something similar.
This is what I appreciate a lot about your analysis, is that you have very sharp and pointed critiques which have come out, but scattered all through here. You've also been very quick to mention, hey, this is what worked. This is what was good. This is, these are the, the things that these people did really well and why it works, right? Why it did work for them.
Yeah. I mean, I think this idea that there is this sort of, again, there's this fanboy mindset that you have to be 100% praising the people that you're, the kind of tribal leaders of whatever tribe it is that you're in. And that's not healthy, and you invariably run into, your problems when there's insufficient accountability and sort of pushback and critique. And so I try to be as maximally fair, as I can be on these things. I mean, one of the advantages of that I have is I'm not part of the movement itself, and I don't aspire to be. Right, I'm not likely to be invited to speak at Gospel Coalition, TGC 22 or whatever it is that's coming up.
But you can still invite me if you're listening and you're on the council. But, you can still invite me to speak.
Yeah. So, it's one of those things where like, I don't aspire to join their club. And so, I think that there's and that's also a limiting, that's also, understand that I've made choices that limit me. If I were part of or a member of one of these networks, my own profile would be dramatically boosted, but it would come with a price. And so there's a price to be paid in your strategies, no matter what you do. And that's why you don't want to, I don't think we need to put like all our eggs in any one basket. So yeah, but I try to be fair, and I guess psychologically and just as my personality, I'm very open to, if I look at even the biggest name in any field and I think that they've got something wrong, I'm not afraid to say, I don't think this is right. And then, in my newsletter, when I say that, I'll put 4,000 words, detailing, why that is. It's not just, I'm not just making like half-cocked statements. There's like, here's an 18,000 word write-up on somebody's marriage book that I got sitting in my files that I've never published. And, there are books. There's a book or two sitting on my hard drive that is material that's just research material that's never been published about what I'm doing. So I try to make some, serious investigations of these things.
Well, we don't want to take any more of your time. This has been great. Aaron, before you leave, though, please point our listeners who may not already be following you, to your stuff where you talk about the history of conservatism, you talk about New Calvinism, sex, gender. Tell them where they can find your material.
Go to themasculinist.com and sign up for the newsletter. That's the number one thing to do. I have a once monthly newsletter that, really goes into depth on a lot of these. There's also a podcast, which you can sign up for, usually, 15 to 30 minute episodes with me exploring various aspects of the world. Again, I did a series on kind of political conservatism. I'm going to be doing a series coming up on the old WASP establishment, the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant establishment. I just did a year-long research project on that, actually, and I wrote it up and got some very good feedback on that. And there's different things that I do. I try to give people. I come from a consulting background, and I like to equip people with frameworks and ways of thinking about the world that they can use to make sense of it and kind of plot strategy. And that's one reason I think I've always resonated with Tim Keller, because he equips people in the same way with tools to think about the world. So I sort of aspire to be in that kind of model of not necessarily always telling you, you must think like me, but sort of like this positive, neutral, negative framework. Here are ways for you to think about the world, not the only lens on the world, but a lens on the world that you can use, as a minister, as a Christian, to think about how to live in the now.
Great. Well, I've been very helped by your material. Been reading for a few years now and have greatly benefited from it. Again, one of the things I appreciate about it is, there are these, well thought out critiques and analyses of, various movements, ideas that are out there. While at the same time, you do try to use what you have to help to build up, to give some practical advice, or even pass along practical advice that you come across. So I've benefited from it. I'd recommend anybody go check it out, themasculinist.com. I don't think that you will be disappointed.
We just want to say a big thank you to Aaron Renn for coming on the podcast, discussing New Calvinism, Complementarianism, and the Masculinist.
We've both been very blessed by the Masculinist and some of the work that Aaron's doing. So we really do recommend that you go over and check out what he's doing. I've been subscribed for a couple of years, and it has been tremendously helpful and beneficial in my own thinking and my own lifestyle as well. So get over there, make sure to subscribe to that newsletter.